World Regions Geography, Lecture 2, Part 2, Historical Legacies and Landscapes. Mercantile capitalism was the rise of the traders. The traders were groups of merchants and bankers that together in Venice and Pisa, in the Netherlands, in England, in the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe, gathered together and independently and together formed these complex networks of trading and banking systems that were the basis for modern capitalism. It began to take the strength away from the landowning class, which had existed under the feudal system, and began to turn Europe into a burgher class, which moved the shift of wealth and power from land to trade, and from cash poor, land rich to cash rich, and not necessarily owning large pieces of land. The Age of Discovery, which began really kind of with the Crusades and the aftermath of the Crusades, that reopening of the Middle East to Europe and Europe to the Middle East, you began to have these interactions, and in a very short time, people began to explore. And it was really a competition for trading rights, because the Arabs, the Muslims controlled the Middle East, and they controlled trading with India, with the spices, with China, through that. And so you had European powers begin to look at it, look for ways around that, and the first country was Portugal, and they began to navigate down along the African coast and finally around South Africa and over to India, and open up that trading route to circumvent Muslim control of those trading routes, of those goods that were coming out of India and out of the Spice Islands. And so these innovations in business, in banking, and innovations in shipping, innovations in navigating, all of this technology came together to form this Age of Discovery, which led then to the Spanish exploration, discovery of North and South America, and the full-blown age of colonialism. So the geographic knowledge, which people were very limited with at that time, began to expand dramatically as they began mapping these regions. And the shift in orientation from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, that was a big difference. The Entrepot is really about these ports that developed in these river estuaries, such as Paris on the Seine, London on the Thames, and Antwerp. Those ports began to develop, and those became the centers for the European powers. They began exploring the Atlantic and the rest of the Pacific and the globe and the South Pacific and Indonesia, and forming colonies. And these colonies allowed them to start to extract wealth and to accumulate capital. And the major shift from the 14th century through today. Colonization is really about resource extraction, improvements in navigation and weaponry, in shipping. This is what gave them the power to colonize, because they could come into an area, they brought superior weapons, they could bring a military force, they could bring colonists, they could protect those colonists, and they could drive out existing peoples or conquer existing peoples. And this gave the rise to industrial capitalism, which is this whole concept of taking capital and investing it in industry, reducing the cost of production and increasing mass quantities of goods, and then shipping those into the areas where they were taking out this resources, the raw materials, shipping this finished goods back. And this is what devastated economies and created all the wealth in Europe. Industrialization. There was a series of technological systems advances. First wave, second wave, third wave, quadratic. The first wave was the collection of technologies which were centered around steam engines, cotton textiles, and ironworking. They were highly localized. They were limited to a first few regions in England. The second wave, which was the exploitation of that technology, and was the increase with coal-powered steam engines, steel products, railroads, world shipping, and machine tools. And that was more diffused from Britain into this region in here. And the third wave of industrialization saw further reorganization of the geography of Europe as another cluster of technologies of electricity, electrical engineering, and telecommunications brought different resources, needs, and created additional investment opportunities. The United Kingdom, France, and Germany, and most of the Netherlands and Scandinavia and northern Italy dominated this third wave. Historical legacies. Well, imperialism is a pretty big deal. Imperialism was that large number of territories that were controlled by individual European countries. So imperialism was that whole system of imperial organization. This shows the United Kingdom, this little tiny country right there, and all of these territories it controlled. At one time, about a third of the people and about 25% of the land area was controlled by the United Kingdom. And it was due to their navy and their ability to project their power throughout the globe. And what disrupted that, what ended that, was World War I. It was actually a series of 3 events within a 20, 30-year period, 1914 to 1945. You had World War I start in 1914. You had a lot of upheaval in Europe during the 20s. Some areas, particularly Germany, was fairly well depressed, had paid huge reparations. People were recovering. The economies never really recovered. And then you had the onset of World War II in 1939 and all the destruction. That finished off most of the European countries. And by the end of World War II, between 1945 and 1965, most of the European-controlled territories around the globe that had been parts of imperial systems were free and independent countries. After the war, because of the extensive reduction, the U.S. started a Marshall Plan, particularly with Europe, and the whole idea with the Marshall Plan was to rebuild Western Europe as a buffer against the Soviet Union, which was this region and controlled Eastern Europe. State socialism is something that arose during post-war years, partly to provide social services and partly probably as a buffer against communist inroads into Western Europe. Eastern Europe became a buffer zone for the Soviet Union in that this Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania this region right through here became a buffer zone controlled by the Soviet Union. And the term Iron Curtain was coined by Winston Churchill. And he said, Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. And that was kind of the post-World War II beginning of the Cold War. Satellite states with command economies. Command economy is what we think of communism. Command economies just simply means that the government determines what and how much of what will be produced, not the economy and not demand. In the West, in capitalism, it is largely determined by demand. So if consumers want something, some company's going to produce it. In the East, it wasn't that way. It was what the government wants produced, and they'll determine how much. Now, Comecon was a group of Eastern European countries that formed kind of like what the EU is. So it was a trading group of Eastern European countries. Industrial growth, very strong in Western Europe, not as great in Eastern Europe. Cityscapes tended to be very drab, not at all what we would consider beautiful or nice cities, but very functional. Very functional, a lot of concrete, not a lot of adornment, very plain. Now, as the Cold War went on, in the 80s, an arms race began that ended up in the collapse of state socialism. Basically, the U.S. and its allies were able to force the Soviet Union to try to keep up with the U.S. and the West in terms of arms, and they forced the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union, and state socialism collapsed. And what that did, for the first couple of years, there was horrendous unemployment, lack of social support, high drug use, rise of very powerful crime syndicates, rise of oligarchies, which are elites who govern and control large parts of it. There were some market reforms. In other words, it did move towards capitalism, not exactly the Western model. There's still some difference, and in China you see even more differences. But there was some market reforms and a move towards capitalism versus socialism, so it's no longer a state-controlled command economy. The reintegration of Eastern Europe into with the rest of Europe was cheap land so that companies could move in there, whether they were farming or manufacturing. There was lots of cheap labor, so it brought in a lot of what they call foreign direct investment. That was money that came from the U.S. and Western Europe into Eastern Europe. Since then, these countries, many of these countries have joined the EU. Part of that is probably for economic reasons, and part of it is because of their fear of the Russians stepping back in and creating a buffer zone again. And you see a little bit of that between the Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula in Russia right now. Inflation, unemployment, and homelessness appeared quickly in the collapsing East, and it was very ugly. There's plenty of videos you can watch on it. It was not a very pleasant situation for the people there. You had at that time a lot of drug addiction, a lot of prostitution, a lot of crime, a lot of people trying to get out of Russia and Eastern Europe, a lot of immigration to the West. Sacramento has roughly